Are we broadcasting?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, yes, I can see people coming in. Hello, everyone. This is the COVID-19 vulnerabilities and identities events that we have been having for the past many weeks. Today, you will notice that we changed the format back to what we had been doing before the past 2 weeks, where we used a webinar format. Today, if you feel comfortable, I'm going to ask you to turn on your video so that we can see you and we can all see each other. If you do not feel comfortable, it's absolutely okay not to do it. My name is Rogerio Pinto. I am a professor and the Associate Dean for Research at the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan. And here we are, just about 4 months since we started this event. I'd like to start today by just reminding us that a few days ago, in um, was it in Arizona or was the other one? No, was the one in Tulsa. So that a few days ago, our president called coronavirus the Chinese virus and referred to COVID-19 as the Kung flu. This is initially what made us start this series, was a series of COVID-19 and um, stigmatization. And this has progressed to a very deep conversation about stigmatization, of course, but the many types of stigmatization that came along as we kept talking about COVID-19. And it became very clear to us that identity was a major issue, that depending on your identities, they were in many ways connected to your vulnerabilities to COVID-19 and your vulnerabilities for being stigmatized and in some ways even attacked. And so this group has been talking about the idea and the possibility that in many ways the responses that we have observed um, to address COVID-19 have not necessarily been just a matter of incompetence. They have been very clearly designed to do exactly what it is that they are doing, to stigmatize some populations, to neglect some populations, to create disparities, and in many ways create the possibility of elimination of certain portions of the population, not only in the United States, but also across the globe. Along the way, we began to see many of the ugly manifestations of white supremacy as they were related to COVID-19. And in the past many weeks, we have seen even further very violent, brutal manifestations of white supremacy, and this time around in law enforcement. And then, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, the connections that the media and other people began to make between social work and law enforcement, or perhaps a connection between the two, or perhaps something that is that social work is missing in law enforcement, and sometimes, from my perspective, even the hint that law enforcement may be missing in social work. And so that became one more concern and another major issue for us to deal with. And two of my guests, not too long ago, wrote a letter, an open letter to the Council on Social Work and Education and to all of us to begin to pay attention about the relationship between law enforcement and social work. While they were writing the letter, our students were also writing emails and documents asking us in the School of Social Work to think about what is it? What is this connection between law enforcement and social work? And what is our responsibility for white supremacy inside social work? What's the history of it? And so it is based on those issues that I just shared with you that I invite 5 people to come and talk to us about those things. This will be a two-part event. Next week, we will continue the conversation on the same topic. I am hoping that law enforcement will join us next week. But without further ado, and before I introduce my panel, I'm going to do what I have been doing for the past many weeks, which is to ask all of us to stop for a moment and give a few moments of silence to think about and to pray or to concentrate or meditate or simply just to stop for a few moments in commemoration of those that we have lost, not only to COVID, but to all the irresponsibilities and the brutalities that we have seen in the past several weeks. So I ask you to just join me in a few moments. Thank you all for joining me. If you want to continue with your eyes closed, it's totally okay for another few moments. So I encourage everyone to participate in the chat room as much as you'd like. There's always a beautiful conversation happening as we are having a discussion here. I would love to introduce Laura Abrams, who is a fabulous colleague, professor at UCLA, Luskin Social Welfare School, and she and my other guests will be talking about themselves as they come to talk to us. I also, Laura, just wave your hand for 2 seconds. So yeah, because there's a lot of people there. Thank you. I would like to introduce you to Allan Dettlaf, who is Dean and Professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, both of them the co-authors of that open letter that I just told you about. I have the pleasure to introduce you to James Simmons, which I don't think is needs to be introduced. I think we probably all know who she is. And she's one of our students in social work at the University of Michigan. Is it Simmons or Simons, Jamie?
Simmons.
So the second one was right. Thank you so much. And Jamie's going to also speak about herself as well as she introduces more of the subject at hand. I'd love to introduce Nina Jackson, who is a PhD candidate of the joint program. Thank you very much. And I have absolutely the pleasure to have William Lopez for the second time as a guest, clinical assistant professor in public health at the University of Michigan, who has written a beautiful book. And I will, put the name of the book and everything in the chat room in a moment, who will also be speaking to us about his own experience in preparation. Well, I'll let him explain to you his connection to an understanding of law enforcement. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Laura to start us off by introducing perhaps what it is that motivated her, and then I'm going to be moving to Allan. What motivated them to write this letter, this open letter to all of us? And then we'll move from there with my questions that most of you have gotten accustomed to. So Laura, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me today. So it is, there's been a lot going on, obviously, in response to the murder of George Floyd, and in terms of social work education and our leadership. There's been several competing and kind of paradigms about what social work should do in relation to law enforcement. So just to rewind, everything's been happening very fast, but to rewind 1 week before we penned the open letter on Medium, I was asked to speak about diversion of city funds in LA to the press, and in terms of like the police taking over social work roles and what we should do about it. I started to, and my background is in criminal justice. So I started to think about this and was writing an op-ed to the LA Times about why social work is different from law enforcement, and how social workers are not going to be the saviors of law enforcement if law enforcement continues to operate within its current paradigm of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. That week, Trump posed an executive order about policing, and NASW appeared to endorse it at first with a tweet with Donald Trump's picture and a kind of a, this is social work's moment. And so I thought, okay, this is interesting, but if social work continues to align with this reformist position, then we're not moving the needle in terms of our commitment to social justice and anti-racist practice and policy. So I called Allan, who I know very well, and we've done some work together. And I thought, this is the time to lead as social work chairs and deans and directors. Our students want us to lead too. So why not make a public statement? So just really quickly, we called for NASW to take a stronger stand to reject Trump's executive order, but also to endorse the Black Lives Matter position around divestment and defunding of policing. We had 5 position points. We know that social work is not unified in its response to working with or against law enforcement, shall we say. But at the very least, we think that there are abolitionist strands in our profession that aren't always heard, and that we need to have a more serious conversation about the defunding position, which social work has, the leadership has kind of taken a step back from, I think, and not publicly endorse Black Lives Matter policy platform. So we put it out there, and just with a couple tweets, we got over 1,100 signatures in a few days. So I'll pass the baton to Allan, because I was hoping, I hope I gave some context to the letter.
I think you gave great context, and I think it's important for us to have that. Of course, I encourage everyone to read the letter. I can put a link in the chat.
I put it in.
Oh, you did. You just did. Thank you so much. And of course, I put it in the invitation to the event. So, Allan, what would you like to add or say differently, or just reinforce for us?
Thanks first for the invitation to be here, and thanks, Laura. That was a great kind of context of what the events leading up to the letter. I think the other thing that we tried to convey in the letter is that we think that we as a profession need to be careful in thinking that we're this magic solution to ending racism in law enforcement if we rush in and take over some of their roles. We as a profession and as social workers haven't reckoned with the racist origins of our profession and the racist outcomes that we see in most of the systems that we work. My background's in the child welfare system, which has for decades had seen horrible racist outcomes impact Black and brown children, and specifically Black children. We've known for decades that Black children have been overrepresented in child welfare systems. And we also know that the child welfare system began in the late 1800s, early 1900s as a system designed to help and support white children, and intentionally excluded Black children from that system. And then over decades, policies and practices were developed to reinforce that, to intentionally exclude Black children and to support white children. That has changed in our history, where Black children are now over-included rather than excluded, but it's the result of racist policies that have been developed in that system for many, many years. So I think sometimes social workers think that we don't have biases, or we're better equipped to deal with some of these issues with racism than other professions. But I think we need to take a step back and look more critically at the origins of our profession, what we're teaching our students. Are we talking about the racist origins of our profession? Are we really approaching our education from an anti-racist lens? Because I don't think we collectively have done a good job of that. So I think we need to take a step back and critically look at our own profession and that racist outcomes that we see in the systems we work, because we as social workers are the ones who are creating those racist outcomes.
Thank you so much, Alan. It is sobering, of course, to hear what you're saying. It is something that I agree with. And I thank you for actually providing some examples, and I'm hoping that as we keep moving the conversation that we'll come to more. So before I go to our students, I'm gonna ask Bill Lopez, in the with the idea of exemplifying how sometimes social work comes very close to law enforcement, and your perceptions of how. So I'll let you describe, what it is you think is most appropriate, but with the idea of, helping us keep exemplifying how law enforcement and social work and public health, for that matter, sometimes come together, and to amplify the idea that we are also talking about law enforcement that is not just local, but it's, law enforcement related to immigrants and other populations that are not necessary. So I'll let you do that for us.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me, Dr. Pinto. So my name is William Lopez. I'm clinical assistant professor in the School of Public Health. So thank you as well to the panelists and to everyone for inviting me on what is largely a discussion of social work. I'm happy to be here and I take the role seriously. I think Alan and Laura really gave some, encouraged us to think of the context of social work, but also the context of policing. And I find it incredibly important as a public health professional to think of the context and the history of policing and where we've ended up with, what we've ended up with today. To briefly tell you how I ended up looking at police, because I think it's really relevant to what I'm about to say. I wrote a dissertation, and when I was doing my work, I was looking at the impact of an immigration raid that happened a few miles from where we all sit at the University of Michigan, or from where many of us sit at the University of Michigan. And part of that work was writing along with police officers to see how they talked about deportation, right? But I was doing this in 2014 and 2015. And if you remember where we are then, or where we were then, Eric Garner was killed in 2014. Michael Brown was killed in 2014. Laquan McDonald was killed in 2014. In Washtenaw County, Ora Rosser was killed in 2014. Tamir Rice was killed in 2014. Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, all killed in 2015. So while I was writing with officers, learning about immigration, what they wanted to and tended to talk about was Black Lives Matter movement, whether they called it that or not. And lots of what I saw was the rhetoric used to deport and detain immigrants was the same as the rhetoric used by police to arrest and imprison Black men and women. And not only was the rhetoric the same, right? So we think of rhetoric of criminality. Latinos might be narcotraficantes or drug traffickers, while Muslims, for example, may be quote unquote terrorists, right? This same fear mongering. But sometimes the literal tools were the same too. In the raid I studied, a no-knock warrant was used because of alleged drugs in the house. And if you all remember, a no-knock warrant was just used in the killing of Breonna Taylor for the same thing, right? For drugs in her apartment, alleged drugs in her apartment. So as I started to see, not only was the rhetoric and the tools used to enforce oppression on these two communities, but there was times that one agency would borrow from the others, and we see this in the rallies here after the killing of Floyd. CBP, a Customs and Border Patrol drone, was used to monitor protesters, right? Officers, ICE officers were sent to help protect law enforcement during these protests as well. So we see ICE engaging in stopping these protests, just as we see police, especially under the war on drugs rhetoric, engaging in immigration enforcement. So the last thing I'll say, I just like to, thinking of the historical perspective, briefly, I teach a lot about health inequities, and I will often say that the disparate maternal mortality rates when Black women are giving birth, and Black women are much more likely to die giving birth than white women. And universally, when students and professors hear this, they're like upset and they say, what can we do? What can we fix? And I say that same thing about police. Police are more likely to kill Black folks, Native American folks, and Latino folks. And almost universally, folks start getting defensive, right? So why are you attacking the police? Why are you attacking? And they'll say individual police officers they know, but nobody tells me about individual doctors they know. And I think I say this because I think it's extremely important that many folks find, sure, they know a good officer, there was a good officer in the family, they know a good doctor, But the disparate rate of maternal mortality is unjust, just as the disparate rate of police killing is unjust, right? Even if you know individual officers. So I invite us to think historically, systemically of the outcomes of this profession, as well as we're thinking about how we collaborate with them. Thank you, Dr. Pinto.
Oh, thank you. And I'm going to go back to you anyway. That's not the last we're going to hear from you. I just want to highlight something that Bill said. I mean, what he's talking about is like micro and macro, right? I mean, so it's like we are teaching our social workers to go out, to demonstrate, to teach them advocacy. And now we are talking about, you know, partnering with those who may be telling them not to be doing it, or to control the actions that may be happening in the very things that we are teaching them to do, and in some ways, you know, encouraging them to do. So I just want us to think about that as I'm going to be going to Nina and Jamie, and to ask them to talk to us about their concerns as students of social work. I graduated a long time ago, and I think if I was having that conversation when, and I'm not going to say how many years, but if I was having that conversation then, I'm not sure how I would have reacted. So I think it would be, you know, I would love to hear from both of you. How does that strike you? And that's just the first question that I'm going to ask you. And then we'll move to a more detailed conversation about the very idea of white supremacy in social work. So I'm going to start with Jamie, and then I'm going to go to Nina. So Jamie, could you please speak to us?
Yes, hello everyone. First off, thank you for all the panelists that spoke before. While you all were talking, I was just like thinking of all these things and reflecting on each of our letters that we wrote to very specific institutions about change. I know when I first heard the discussion about social workers being brought into the conversation or Department of Policing, I was extremely alarmed, as I am whenever anyone uses social workers as the patch fix for racism or any structure within our institutions. I always ask the question, well, what social workers? As a student in a social work program, I see an array of folks that come into these programs for an array of different agendas. And I always question, like, in this profession, we have moved to this very formal, very professionalized system of social work. But the folks that we are letting into these programs don't really align with a lot of things that individual programs or MSW programs overall are advocating for or saying that they align with. I know one thing that I will echo that was in kind of the MSW student demands, as well as the PhD student demands, as well as the letter that was written to NASW, was the need and the idea that social work hasn't addressed our own history. We don't really talk about it. We don't really talk about the history of us and negatively affecting Black communities, like man and house policies, and those policies that smallly year after year like dismantled the Black family structure and things like this. And also, no one rarely talks about the effect that social workers had in indigenous populations of removing children from their families and pushing for white families to adopt these kids as a way to continue the genocide of this individual population. Until we start really addressing and fixing our own problems and frameworks of us upholding white ideologies and white institutions, I really don't see right now how we should be aligning ourselves with police and the criminal justice department that has a very strong and culture that often influences and guides people to often drift off their path of what they might enter that section with or for. And that's coming from my own experience of having a criminal justice degree and getting into criminal justice to really look into the system, because I'm an MSW student. I'm pretty younger. I started college in 2014, where a lot of the murders of Black men and Black folks were really highlighted. And I got into criminal justice to really understand like why police officers weren't going into jail, why were Black folks mass incarceration being pushed into these systems from very young ages. And then my process and journey through criminal justice led me to social work as a way of combining those two entities to answer some questions for myself and possibly for my community and the society as a whole. So yeah, the whole understanding of history and engagement and like how all these things fit together, I think social work has a long way to go.
Thank you, Jamie. And wow, of course, now let's hear from Nina, and then I'll make, a comment. So just react to all the other panelists or bring in anything new that you'd like, Nina, please.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, the other panelists who've spoken, Jamie, my fellow student. And so I am entering my 4th year as a doctoral candidate in the joint PhD program in social work and social science that we have at Michigan. My social science is anthropology. And I received my MSW from Michigan as well. I completed that in 2016. And while I was in my MSW, I had 2 different field placements because of the particular international social work track that I was on. The first was a field placement here in the US. It was an in-school intervention with mostly Black girls and girls of color. And my second field placement was in Australia in a foster care agency working with Aboriginal youth. And in both of those cases, I was coming in as a white student to be social worker, and I didn't really have rigorous critical language for assessing the entirety of those dynamics and my particular role in them. And so while I was in my MSW, I started pursuing a certificate in African American and diasporic studies in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies here at U of M. And in as much as I support, that the AFAM studies department, I think, it's unfortunate that in order to develop a critical vocabulary about critical race theory, in as much as it relates to social work, to go outside of our school for that is kind of a lacuna. We have the opportunity to be engaging critical race theory here, and we absolutely have to. I think that it's really important that in as much as social work, especially a Master's of Social Work program, is a professionalization project, we have to confront the fact that social work is very much tied to white feminism and professionalization of white women. We have to look at that, especially since the majority of people who pass through MSW programs to this day are white women. So there's a critical intersectional component that we have to deal with, which is the role of white feminism. And the ways in which white women as social workers historically have served as kind of handmaidens to the state, and the ways in which we as social workers are often positioned as state agents, and the ways in which we have a history of targeting and surveilling Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. So there's a lot to work with. Currently, my dissertation research doesn't explicitly grapple with all of some of the topics that I just mentioned. However, from a pedagogical standpoint, and particularly from a professionalization standpoint, it's really important that we grapple with the history of our profession, as all of the panelists have said. I think that, as Allan and Laura's letter said, we're excited that there's so much attention and even material resources being directed toward the social work profession in this moment where social work has kind of come to the fore as the ideal alternative, even like the sort of utopian alternative to policing. And I think that we can seize on this as a moment to radicalize social work. However, I also think it's very telling that the kind of, in the public imagination, social work is seen as this kind of faultless savior. I mean, that word is obviously a big part of our profession that we have to grapple with, but that it is not a sort of instrument of the state in the same way that policing is. And we have to grapple with the fact that we are, and how can we negotiate that, if not radicalize that entirely. So happy to be here and talk. Thank you so much for listening, and back to you.
Thank you, Nina. So Here we are halfway through our hour, and I think I learned a few things, right? One is that we have, as a social work as a profession, in many ways, not only created an environment for white supremacy and surveillance, and I would like to add to the list that Nina presented to us, it's also white women surveilling themselves, right? Because that's, the internalization of that kind of behavior, and how a lot of women begin to internalize, the oppression that they have felt their entire lives, in perpetuity. But I also heard that it seems to me, from what I heard from all of you, we do not quite understand very well what's going on in the minds of someone who may be enforcing the law. From what I hear, Bill talking about, like there's a conversation, there is a language, there's a way that people do those things. But I don't think that as social workers, we truly understand what it is that a person who puts their uniform in the morning goes outside and then ends up kneeling on somebody's neck. I don't know if we have a clear understanding of what that means, what's going on inside of that person's head. And I think that that's one thing that we clearly don't know. We also do not know very well um, how to undo white supremacy within our professions, because if we have been in many ways the perpetuators of some of it, so who's going to do the teaching, right? When does it happen? How does curriculum look when we are intentionally trying to do that? And I ask that question a little reluctantly, because I don't think that the answer is always where we go first, which is the curriculum of social work. I don't think that what all of you talked about is going to change by changing the curriculum of social work, because what that will do, what it does to me, is to say that there's something about our students that they don't know that we are going to teach them, but we don't know the thing that we need to teach. So I'm going to give this question to Laura and to Allan to elaborate on a little bit. I mean, it's a conundrum to be, because the profession has itself internalized a lot of the things that we are talking about. How you get out of it? We can't all, we can't have therapy, right? Or have some shrinking of our heads as a profession. How do we move this forward without going back to the same place, which is the curriculum? So I'll go with Laura first.
Okay. Well, I don't, as you said, there really isn't one answer. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is, among students and a younger generation, not my generation, there is new language that CSWE and NASW have not incorporated into the ethics and the learning objective of our profession. So I think while our leadership is a bit stuck in cultural competence and cultural humility and cultural awareness and multiculturalism, which was an advance from not having those ethics, right? Our students have like moved way beyond that to critical theory and positionality and dismantling white supremacy and naming white supremacy and anti-racist praxis, so if we're not using that language, the newer critical race language, we're not keeping up with, like Nina said, what's really happening around in the structures of racism that we need to be really thinking through more carefully. That said, that's only one piece, is kind of what we name and what we know. So lately, I've been looking at, if we're writing a letter to NASW or writing a letter, an open letter, use the terms racist, use the term anti-racism. Don't couch things in bias or competency, you know, and I think that just that from the leadership perspective can start to change the discourse around what we are doing as social workers. But that language has not been incorporated yet into NASW and CSWE and the people that kind of lead how we think and talk about social work curriculum and practice.
In large, to a certain extent, even to syllabi across the schools in the country, right?
Well,
I mean, it's not just the language of the institutions that govern social work, but it is.
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
So our faculty, for example, decided not to wait until CSWE develops an anti-racist EPAS competency. We're going to write one ourselves and put it into the curriculum as one of our steps at UCLA. Why wait for it to be a CSWE mandate? We can add on to the foundation competencies. You're allowed to do that, or the advanced competencies. But again, what you said is really important. Just because it's in the syllabus does not mean that we know how to teach these issues. And most of our faculty are not trained to have those discussions, especially when students are coming in with such disparate experiences and views. And faculty haven't, and students don't agree upon necessarily how they're going to talk about race and racism in the classroom, which should be in every class, not just the one class on diversity, so to speak, you know. But Allan, I think over there, has been ahead of this in terms of leading Houston, where I think other folks were like trying to catch up, so I think I'll pass the baton.
Let's hear from Allan. And if you could include in your comments, you know, it's my own thing. I mean, I've been saying this for quite a while, where I feel that sometimes we as faculty do not speak the same language. You know, we are talking about diversity, students are talking about white supremacy, and you know, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, so I think as you've both mentioned, there is a role for curriculum and our bigger educational professional organizations to play. At the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston, we've been engaged in anti-racist efforts for several years now to try and really reinforce that with our students in terms of curriculum changes that we've made, outside of the classroom educational experiences that we try to provide to our students. And really, we view social work education as teaching our students to be anti-racist activists. I tell all of our students that's my expectation of them when they graduate. But I think, as you mentioned, Rogeria, it goes beyond what education can do. I think we really need to be focusing on the systems that we work in and how we as social workers are complicit in the racist outcomes that we continue to see in those systems. You know, I think I wanted to mention something that Nina said earlier. You know, I think there's this idea that the reason why social workers are having this moment in the media and what some people think is this response is because we're viewed as being helpful as social workers. I think that's true among white people. I don't think that's true among communities of color. I don't think that social workers are viewed as helpful among communities of color at all. I think, you know, as I mentioned, I work in the child welfare system, or I've worked in the child welfare system. And I think because that system is so synonymous with what social work is, obviously you all know social work does much more than child protective services, but the Child Protective Services system is viewed by many people as equivalent to law enforcement in many ways. It's viewed as a system of family regulation. And I think we need to really look at the policies and the practices of those systems that create and reinforce racial inequities. In the child welfare system, for decades now, we've applied an intervention to children and families to address a problem that actually causes more harm and trauma to the children that we're trying to help. I think those are the kind of things we need to be looking at. We have policies and practices in place in the systems that we work in that forcibly and involuntarily separate children from their families and actually causes more harm and trauma than anything that was happening in those families before social workers became involved with them. That's where I think we need to be looking at the systems that we work in and how they're continuing to oppress people of color. That's how we take it outside of just the education and curriculum. It's the systems that we work in are the problem.
Thank you so much, Alan. And you know, and as I'm listening to you, I'm reading the chat. You know, please, guys, talk on the chat and see the things that are happening there. And if there is a burning question for the, you know, for the panel, please place the question in the box, and I'll be making sure to weave your question, you know, as much as I can. But going from what Alan just said, and looking at in Bill's comment and there's a very nice reference in that which I'm gonna read. But the beginning of what Bill is saying is that the law enforcement officers often see their jobs as callings, where they are helping people, right? I have read thousands of applications for social work programs that start like that, callings and, you know, helping people. So, Bill, what can you tell us that you have learned about what's going on in the minds of those who are enforcing the law from your perspective?
Sure, I think you're focusing on calling and thinking of it as police profession and perhaps as social work or even public health profession is really telling. So when I was doing this work and what I was witnessing and researching is police continue to refer to this as a calling. And often when we're doing this kind of ethnographic work, we see things happen that don't make sense. And then eventually when we see them all together and think of them all together, it's like a puzzle. It starts to make sense. And one of the things I saw is that police officers continued to talk about when they would save animals, right? One officer said like, oh, the back of the police station is my favorite place because look, we have a dog kennel, we save dogs there, right? Then there was other situations in one, and if you read the book, it's a fairly powerful story, but I won't go into it now. An officer stopped a car to get a turtle out of the road. And then when they wouldn't talk about animals, they would also talk about these kind of exemplary populations and something that would happen that would violate them, right? So one example is a World War II veteran whose coin collection was stolen, right? And they kept doing this and they kept doing this. And as I put it into perspective, what was happening is that officers were often showing, and this is what the research says as well, that they are the people who protect the innocent, right? And these animals that they found in the street were innocent. People like older adults were innocent. But what I really had to come to understand is that in a place in which police first started to enforce the slave trade, and then followed up even after in the Jim Crow South existed to keep white folks in white spaces and black folks in black spaces. That is, for centuries, what police saw as breaking the law was black skin out of place because it literally was breaking the law, right? So in this world with this historic context, we start to see that if police are heroes and there's an innocent population, which is often children or women, where do black folks, where do undocumented folks, where do Latinos fit in? And often they could only fit in this role of the villain, right? The person who had to be stopped to keep these other people safe. And I'll just give one more example, and then I'll stop. But often when officers were talking about the killings of folks during the Black Lives Matter, they would always say what a threat the person was, right? So Michael Brown was a bully. And there was just no way that these black men who were killed and women, at the time black men who were killed, could be anything other than the villain in this historic policing narrative, right? And so to go back to where we were, I often think of my, perhaps in your field, social work, but my field of public health, and what is the historic roots of that field? Where does race play into it? And what am I playing in that role? And who are the populations I'm serving? And do I need to change that or adjust it or reconstruct how I'm thinking about this?
And so there are many questions happening in the box. And as Bill was talking, so of course many questions came up in there. But I'm gonna, build on what you just said, and ask Jamie to perhaps start us answering, I think, part of the question that Justin is asking here, which is what happens when we inside of social work begin to question the very thing that we are doing here, right? Is that a consequence? Do we get penalized for critiquing social work from within. And I think the other thing that I'm going to add in that, and you say as much as you can, is also the question. I think I focused on curriculum, and I think I was thinking classroom. But Lorraine is asking about field placement, which of course is an enormous part of the social work education. And I want all of us to wrap our heads around the fact that we teach social workers not only in the classroom, but we teach social workers, you know, most programs 3 days a week in the field. So Jamie, what reactions do you have to that?
First off, that's a question that I grappled a lot with in starting the movement within the School of Social Work, with uplifting the Black students' demands and presenting that information to the UM School of Social Work. It was just like, well, here I am, a social work student that came into social work from criminal justice, from that framework. And here I am feeling kind of out of place because curriculum that's happening right now isn't aligning with like what the students, specifically a lot of students of color and folks that are interested in co-liberation work, are getting into and wanting and needing to learn about and wanting guidance in. And I know for myself, I decided to take that risk of, well, I'm going to critique this institution. This is something, I'm in an institution that thrives itself as the #1 school of social work, which I want it to be. And it needs to be. All schools of social work needs to be the #1 school of social work. And in aiming for that goal, you need to start adapting and not even adapting, radically changing this historic system that you were built upon. I had a conversation with folks that were students many years before I was, about things that they wanted and demands that they have that aligned a lot closely with the Black student, MSW students here, demands of like what we wanted for change within administration, change within curriculum, funding changing. And as a person of color, there's always a risk of when I choose to critique a white institution and choose to use my voice. I'm 23, graduated in December, looking for jobs. It was a very big risk of doing that self-critique and self-reflection within the system that I am a part of. And I know for me, when I think about going back to the question that was a few minutes ago, like, where do we start? Like, how do we get to this or get further than this? I personally look a lot into admissions. And I also look into like the professors and lecturers that we have. Like a lot of these schools and institutions have amazing lecturers, so amazing history that might align with the direction that was in the past, but now in this era of radical thinking, radical change, defunding the police, dismantling racism and pushing for anti-racist work, there is a need for a new kind of thinking, a new kind of radical professor or lecturer information. I think that especially MSW programs need to start looking within their faculty of like, who can uplift this new need, this new change, this new direction of our society. And also with admissions, I look at a lot of my cohort. I know folks who are BIPOC that had to interview to get into this program. These are folks with military backgrounds that came and went back to school, or someone that's a Latinx folks from California who worked herself up, went to teach in DR, teaching middle school students or high school students, and still had to work a lot harder than a lot of the white students who are coming into this program without a sense of what racism is, without a sense of what intersectionality is, very, very minimum information that they were chosen for spots over even white individuals who might have been further in this work. So I think within social work programs, specifically MSW programs, we really have to start looking into our admissions process and saying like, well, this is the direction that we're going to. First off, I would like to say that myself and my org, ABSW, within the School of Social Work, Like we helped hang up a sign at the beginning of the year that reads, at Michigan Social Work, we believe Black Lives Matter. Women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Love is love. Environmental justice is social justice, and community is everything. We push the school to display this as a way of living living and breathing these anti-racist things that in pods that we were pushing. I think someone earlier, maybe in a conversation that I had with someone else, emphasized that we need to be not just in our professional life, but if in our interpersonal life, really living as social workers through these frameworks and with these beliefs now. Like things are outdated and we need to all evolve, and those who can evolve should be pushed to the side or removed, but there's a need for more radical liberation work. And I really think that the future of social work, the future of our progress and us becoming all that we inspire this profession to be as fundamental pillars of our society, on top of like that initial work that we need to do to address our history and dismantle our own white supremacy ideology. Like we really need to start professionalizing and really honing in on our missions and who we are uplifting as social workers.
So I hear two very good recommendations that are some that have been made already before, right? I mean, we need to be more stringent about who is teaching in our schools of social work, making sure that they have the knowledge to do what it is that they are doing. That's what I heard you saying. And we need to be a bit more careful as to how we select the students that we take in. I'm just going to leave it as that, and I'm going to ask Nina. And I just want to say one thing, because Laura very rightly pointed out there are many good examples across the country, right? And there are many good instances of doing this work in this school as well. I think what may be missing over and over again is how to bring all of these things together and make the intentions that, or the assuming intentions align with the things that people are actually doing. That's, part of the problem as well. And so I think that what James says is also true for so many schools of social work. And that leads us back to what we started with, which is it's a systemic thing, right? So that each school of social work is already part of this system that is guided by the same council, by the same national association. But Nina, I would like for you to react to Jamie and make any recommendations that you may have. And then I'm going to move, because we are approaching the hour, and then I'm going to move to Laura and Allan to give us some recommendations as well.
Sure. So I mean, a lot of what I have to say affirms and reiterates everything that Jamie just said it so beautifully. I think one of the things that, we need to do is, when we've kind of reached a point where we can't really teach anti-racist or anti-oppressive content without doing so through anti-racist and anti-oppressive pedagogical means. The irony or the hypocrisy in teaching content, teaching a syllabus that holds anti-racist and anti-oppressive content while failing to enact those practices inside the classroom as that content is being taught is a problem. And I think we've reached a point kind of as an academic community where that's no longer acceptable. I know in many cases, there's been calls for sensitivity trainings is something that often police are called to undergo, and other people in power have been called to undergo different kinds of bias trainings, et cetera. But I think we're past the point where a sensitivity or a bias training is enough. I think we have to take on a pedagogically, an anti-oppressive pedagogy. I've been in spaces very recently where we are talking about reformatting or decolonizing syllabi. And even in that very conversation, a BIPOC person speaks and they are ignored, right? So even as we're having these conversations about radicalizing or decolonizing our syllabi, our actions that we're taking in that conversation are still racist. So I think that one of the things that we have to really do is make sure that praxis is at the heart of our pedagogy, of our teaching. We're a praxis-based profession. the content of what we're reading, our theories inform how we act as professionals and how we act as teachers. So that has to be happening in the classroom. And the second thing that I'll say in terms of student organizing is that one of the things that, so the doctoral students put forth a letter to the School of Social Work and to some other deans and to the president of the university. And we wanted to ensure that our process of collectively sourcing and creating this document would be iterative of our goals. So one of the things that we tried really hard to do and are still refining our process around is sort of ensuring that white students or students who hold privilege take up the majority of the labor that's required, even as they work to center, credit, and hold ourselves accountable to BIPOC voices. So I worked closely with a fellow Black scholar who coordinated the letter with me. And I invited her to come to this today instead of me. But I think that it's really important because we had to work together in order for her voice and the voice of my fellow BIPOC colleagues to be at the center of our work, even as we're not asking those people to do the labor of making sure that these tasks are carried out. So I guess those are both sort of two ways of saying that praxis has to be in our classroom. The way that we teach anti-racism has to be done in an anti-racist way. And the ways in which we organize and institutionalize structural change has to be done in an anti-racist way, which finds the balance between centering the voices of BIPOC scholars while having those who hold privilege take up the brunt of that labor.
So I hear you saying, do as you preach.
Yeah.
Laura, you have a couple of minutes to
Sure.
give us final thoughts and recommendations, and then I would like Allan to do the same.
I just want to say, the risk is worth it. I was a little concerned about putting out this letter on social media and the attention, but, it's important that as a tenured white woman who's protected in my position, right? Like, we do have to take the lead, and I'm lead in terms of having that voice. We're also totally considering what Nina just said about, taking on the labor, but not speaking for people. And the other piece I want to end with is that these issues come up so often and it just ends up being shelved in committees and reports. And we know students graduate in 2 years, but as leaders, we can't just be responding to crisis. We have to get ahead of it in terms of really making the changes that are going to last. It's not a commission. It's not a report. It's not, let's form a committee. No, this is time for action that lasts.
Continued action.
Meaningful action.
Thank you, Laura. Allan.
Yeah, I'll quickly add two things. I think following up on what Jamie said related to admissions, I think we as schools of social work need to eliminate objective measures that just continue to oppress people. At our school, we eliminated GRE as a requirement several years ago. Next year, we're eliminating GPA as an admissions criteria. GRE and GPA are not measures of academic ability. They're measures of privilege, and we shouldn't be considering those as part of our admissions criteria. And then the second thing, I think we as a profession, following up on what Lorraine said, we need to really grapple with the issue of field education, which is deeply problematic. We can do whatever we want within our educational institutions to make our curriculum anti-racist, but the reality is we're sending our students into racist institutions to learn how to be social workers. Until we figure out a way to address that, we're not going to see different outcomes.
Wow. I mean, the hour goes so quickly, and I want to thank each, and all of you. I'm always moved by the conversations. I think we have been able to have really authentic conversations in this format, and I think today we again had a very authentic conversation. And the only way we can have those authentic conversations is when we have authentic guests. So I want to thank Bill Lopez for being here with us, James Simmons, and now I said it correctly, I hope, Nina Jackson Levin, and Laura Abrams and Allan Dettlaf for joining us and for really sharing their very personal views and professional views on all of those issues. We'll be back next week. It's part 2 of what we did today. The questions will be a bit different, and I think that I would like to go back and concentrate a bit more on law enforcement itself and have that perspective as we move forward. And then so that we can be informed and perhaps have more of those discussions as we move forward. So again, thank you to all my participants. Your interactions on the chat box was incredible, and I look forward to being here next week again. So see you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Rogerio.